Can you hear me if I do this? Here, you can hear. Okay, thanks, everybody. Please, colleagues. Okay, so despite the background noise in the room, I'm moving on with the hope that I can be heard. Now, I have what seems the almost impossible task, I think maybe it is an impossible task, of summarizing yesterday's meeting, which was huge, obviously, a lot happened. So the analogy that kept on coming back to me was of the couple of the great works of literature from where I'm from, Shakespeare, Harry Potter, but not these works themselves. You may or may not know that these works were distilled into plays. The entire work of Shakespeare, the entire Harry Potter was distilled into a 7-act play. So, ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you my attempt at an abridged summary of day 1 on universal child grants in 6 acts. I did it in 1 less. Act 1, the scene is set. I should just say there are a lot of artistic liberties in this, but I'm trying to be true to the substance, so you will tell me if I've succeeded. Act 1, the scene is set. A conversation between the highest levels of organizations, Executive Director 4, Deputy Director General Omaru, discussed the importance of childhood, the difference that cash would have made in the past, its power now, and its potential for every child in the future. They commit together to work towards reaching universal social protection for children. Act 2, the wisdom of the keynotes. The scene is the United Nations, where bravery and ideas have changed the world. But what next and where next? Universal child grants? The lights go down and enter from stage left, Keynes. Through the multiplier, the universal child grants can bubble growth from below and increase tax revenues and improve child lives at the same time. But a caution, might universal child grants be a Trojan horse by which we weaken other services and reduce other social protection for children? Act 3, the high-level panel speaks. The scene. How can child poverty be so high and social protection coverage so low? And yet we all agree that childhood is so important and cash makes such a difference. A tension emerges. At a table in the middle of the scene, we have policymakers sitting, trying to figure out the way forward. National policymakers. But coming in from stage left, stage right, from behind, development partners with different advice, not always agreeing, not always coming at the same time, confusion. Can we all sing together in harmony? Can we start with universal child grants for 0 to 5s, or equally categorical grants targeted at children under 5 years of age? As one president once said, yes, we can, yes, we can, yes, we can. And as another said, huge. So there's hope, but there are also questions. How do we pay? What about other services? Does this make sense in every context? Act 4, addressing the questions. I cheated here, there are 3 parts. Act 4, Part 1, human rights. Existing human rights obligations can be enforced, but what implications for other commitments that have been made for rights through children? And a report is launched, the Joint Statement on Persons with Disabilities and Social Protection. Part 2, broader social policy implications. 2 contrasting scenes. The first, a dystopia, where the vision of the Trojan horse is real. Universal child grants grow, but other services are slashed. A vision of universal credit in the United Kingdom, the children becoming poorer than they were before. A contrasting scene. I wouldn't say a utopia, but a possibility. Universal child grants linked to social support services, social support and services, and children and societies thrive. Part 3, dignity and shame. From the shadows and from the light, power is abused. People's worth is questioned and stigma is internalized. Universal child grants could cast these away, but if the benefit amounts are too small, what will they really do? Act 5. The cast sets out on a journey for an answer. We go downstairs to Namibia, Argentina, the United States, Nepal, China, Mozambique, Bangladesh, Morocco, and the mysterious land of targeting effectiveness. Act 6 is today. So we've now caught up to where we are. So let me say a couple of words about what we're going to be doing for the rest of the day. The next session that we have is a really, really interesting one. It's going to be chaired by Francesca, and it's going to be looking at some key debates key pivotal debates and questions, really looking at the sorts of questions that we saw emerge, and hopefully I articulated, that we have been having as an overall international community, but we're going to have them together in a really organized fashion. After these debates, we're going to look in more detail and break out into parallel sessions again. So there are going to be 3 parallel sessions. We're going to be looking at design features in one. We're going to be looking at financing in another. And then we're going to be looking at gender equality and women and girls empowerment in the third. In the afternoon, we have the opportunity to then dive into regional experiences. So we're going to be looking at things by region, and they're going to be split into 2 sessions of 3 regions each. I was going to say a little bit about those sessions, but I think I really want to make sure we have full time for the next session. So just to let you know, the regions we're going to be having will be Latin America, Europe and Central Asia, East and South Asia combined, so that's a really obviously very big one. Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and high-income countries. We're also going to we are going to have plenaries for all of these sessions, but just to warn you, they're going to be really compressed to make it happen. So we're putting a big challenge, as we did for Alejandro yesterday, to really put together a plenary session in very short order. So with that, or maybe just quickly before passing to Francesca, I just want to finish, just let's remind ourselves again of the path we're trying to take and the questions we're trying to answer, just to keep ourselves really focused. So really we want to be looking at this question, is it time for universal child grants? And if so, how do we get there? And I think this session from Francesca was really going to help us set up to do that. But if we hold on to those questions, so by the end we can come up with a sense of what maybe where we do agree and the questions that remain, it would be extremely helpful. So before passing to Francesca, I just want to make one announcement logistically, which is if we could request you don't use that back door of the room because there's another meeting. They're having a sort of World Cafe session behind there, so we would be disturbing them if we did that. So now we're going to move directly to the next panel, so nobody move. And with that, over to you, Francesca, and all the panelists we have. Thanks, everybody.
Good morning. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this morning's roundtable discussion on pivotal debates in universal child grants. My name is Francesca Bastagli. I head the Social Protection and Social Policy Program at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI. Welcome to everyone in the room. Welcome also to those of you that are following us online via the socialprotection.org live stream. Now, this session, as David anticipated, of course, builds on yesterday, including yesterday's plenary discussion, where we heard from international organizations, the ILO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and also fascinating accounts of country experiences. In this session, in this roundtable, we bring together leading researchers, academics, and representatives from two countries, Spain and Nepal, to raise and go into greater detail and depth on some of the key concerns and critical issues that were raised yesterday. Now, some of the issues that come up, well, quite a few have been raised, and David summarized some of these. They range from questions around concepts, terminology, what do we actually mean around universalism, targeting, conditionality, and the range of forms and shapes that these things can take, but also around questions on the intended and unintended effects of alternative schemes. What are the trade-offs? We talked quite a bit about coverage, but what about adequacy, and what are the implications for impact on child poverty and child welfare, but also wider welfare outcomes? What are the implications for affordability and the financing options? What are the political feasibility considerations? And importantly, as was raised by Jayati Grosh and others yesterday, also in a parallel session, where are these social grants positioned within wider social policy and indeed fiscal policy? Now, we've asked the speakers to deliver a short speech, 5-minute speech to start. The researcher academic panelists will share with us what they think are the main critical questions when it comes to universal child grants and ideally also the wider considerations and discussions around universal social protection. And then the two country representatives will share with us the ways in which these issues are being debated in their countries, or indeed how they're being addressed in their countries. Following on then from these short presentations, we'll have the chance to discuss in an open roundtable discussion. We have 6 distinguished speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Kumar Puyal, member of the National Planning Commission from the Government of Nepal, Pau Marie-Clause, Spanish High Commissioner on Child Poverty from the Government of Spain, Margaret Grosh, Senior Advisor for Social Protection and Jobs at the World Bank, Stephen Kidd, Senior Social Policy Specialist at Development Pathways, David Piachaud, Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics, and Olli Kangas, Professor of Practice at the University of Turku and the Director of the Equal Society Research Program at the Academy of Finland. So we'll start with the first 5-minute speeches. David will be keeping the time. Margaret, over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I have big ideas and 5 minutes, so I'm going to see if I can move right to the presentation. As usual, I have a technical difficulty.
The presentation should be uploaded.
It should be, but I'm not.
They're not on the.
It's on the
I'm not
screen
advancing.
there.
There we are.
Oh.
All right. So the conference is titled Universal Child Grants, but that kind of skips right over the targeting issue, which I think is a bit fast, since in fact what we observe in the world today is that every country has some kind of poverty-targeted child program, and there aren't really so many universal child grants. So I wanted to pause and think about why that is. And that's because the power of concentrating few resources where they are most needed is very great. We know it intuitively and we know it quantitatively. We see it in all of the ex-ante simulations of policy design, and we see it in the impact evaluations. So where resources are scarce, which I'm afraid is pretty much everywhere I've ever been in my career, the power of targeting is clear. Now, that power is diluted by the very well-known, well-quantified imperfections and costs of targeting. So we don't pretend these aren't here, but just because choices are hard doesn't mean that they're not sometimes taken. But these I want to pass over a bit quickly because they are, I think, very well known and understood and the source of quite a lot of policy dialogue in many countries. Now we have a hope that by making a universal design, we'll actually release that budget constraint and we'll have a lot more money on the table, and so then we won't have to make hard choices about who gets the money. It's also a very intuitive kind of argument. There's some, median voter theory underlying it, but the intuition is clear. What I'm less clear about is how maybe quantifiable is the wrong word, but how powerful it is, how fast it is, whether there's more that's needed than just a universal design. And I go back to just observing social policy. Over the course of my now growingly long career, we've seen flagship program after flagship program of a poverty-targeted nature launched around the world. We've seen no universal basic income programs launched, funded out of tax revenue. And we've seen, yes, a small number of universal child grants and a larger number of social pensions. But the power of the idea of universalism leading to large budgets seems somehow not yet realized in life. So I think we need to understand this much more clearly. And is it just a change in policy design? If so, what is the moment? What are the trade-offs and the steps to get there? And is it more than that? Do we actually need the body of experience we have about learning how to do more limited programs and the evaluation results? The things that you and I know intuitively that we spout in our sleep about the importance of child poverty and the impacts of social protection programs for children, I think is not well understood by either voters or the politicians they elect. And I think we may have a job to do in that. Now, the other thing that I want to unpack a bit is the notion that usually universal programs are discussed as being a flat benefit. And I want us to reflect for a moment, does it get us to where we want to be to give the same amount to the poor as we would to the non-poor? Is that a strong enough intervention? We have a vision of all of the children, irrespective of where they are on the poverty spectrum, of being nourished, healthy, educated, having good prospects in life. And I'm not sure that a small transfer to them is enough. So maybe we need to be thinking, that universalism is, now I've lost myself. That what we should be thinking about in targeting is not who's in the program, but how much the people in the program get, and concentrating resources among the neediest. So if we think then about about the benefit levels, that leads us to think, there we go, about what are we trying to do? How do we structure the benefit levels? What are we trying to achieve? Is it just ending poverty? Is it focusing on the most sensitive periods, the first 1,000 days? Is it focusing in the, 15 to 18-year-old range where kids are making transitions to adulthood and many are left behind in that? Are we talking about all ages, focused ages, bigger grants in some ages than others? I think all of these things bear a lot of discussion, and we haven't had that much of that here today. So I hope to kickstart that. Well, I am totally a failure with this piece of technology. And the third thing I wanted to say is, can we potentiate the power of the income support that's embodied in a child grant for better human capital outcomes? So there was a wave of CCT programs that tried to do this with conditionalities. I observed that conditionalities are becoming both less common and lighter. They're more social messaging in many cases now. And at the same time, we have the rise of behavioral economics talking about how when you give people money, you not only relieve their cash constraint, you free mental bandwidth. And the household can thereby do more of something. They can think harder, make more determined decisions, have better socio-emotional functioning. Do we want to direct that somehow towards parenting through information or nudges? And if so, do we do that somehow through a child grant program? Or do we leave that to ministries of health and education because the content of the messages is likely to be sort of proprietarial to the Ministries of Health and Education, but they may not have the same contact with households that a large-scale child grant would have. So I want to leave you with those questions about how best child grants can support the human capital and life prospects of the kids that receive them. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Stephen, over to you.
Okay, could you pass the... Well, hopefully, I have 3 slides. Hopefully they'll come up very soon, so we can look at those. So in the very small period of time I have, 5 minutes, I'd like to go through this issue again around the benefits of universal or poverty-targeted programs. I mean, I think that we hear a lot about the poor. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'd like to go through the benefits, and pros and cons of poverty-targeted or universal programs. We hear a lot about the poor, right, and poor children and non-poor children. But we have to realize that this idea that there's a group of children that are poor, a fixed group, is a fictional construct, okay? Most children living in low and middle income countries are living on very, very low incomes. You can look at it, take whatever poverty line you with $3.2, $5, and purchase power parity terms. That's how well you're going to live in the United States. The vast majority of children are living on very, very low incomes. There is no group that is just poor. Further, if you can see in this diagram, just looking at Indonesia, we've ranked, I looked at changes over 1 year from the poorest group in 2009, or we've ranked population in quintiles from the poorest 20% to the richest 20%, and where they are just 1 year later, and we can see massive changes. People's incomes and consumption are changing all the time. There is no fixed group. It's a very, very dynamic situation of the majority of children living in poverty in these countries, and their incomes changing all the time. We can't rank them in this way. So basing our policy on a fictional construct is not a great way to do policy. How do I move it on? This one? Yeah, okay. So secondly, can we actually do poverty targeting? We've been trying it for years. There's been many, many programs that have done it. We've tried with proxy means tests, etc. The answer is no. There's no way we could get anywhere near accurate poverty targeting. We've done a study which will be publishing next month, and this is just looking at some well-known programs around the world, their targeting effectiveness. I don't have time to look at the diagrams. We had a poster session yesterday. It's ranking people from the poorest to richest. Those under the black line are those on the program, those above are those off the program. All those to the left of the red line are the target population, and you can see errors are massive. Even on these well-known programs, errors of 50, 70, 70%, in some of the studies up to over 90% exclusion errors. We can't do accurate poverty targeting. We can't get anywhere near accurate poverty targeting. Let's remember one definition of madness is that you try to do the same thing over and over again and you expect a different result. Actually, I think we have enough experience now to know that we're not going to get a different result. We can't do it. Third point, we need to reconceptualize social protection. Get back to the rights perspective, get back to what was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We hear all about the social protection for the poor and vulnerable. Actually, social protection is for citizens, for everybody. Social protection is a right for all of us, whenever we need it. That's how we need to reconceptualize it. It's for all of us. That's why I receive child benefits for my 3 children. I'm a taxpayer. I deserve to get it as well. Now, those kind of programs are going to benefit the poor much more. And critically, in most countries, they'll move towards universal provision on 3 core areas for older people, for people with disabilities, and for children. That's what we need to see across most countries, and all countries move towards that. Fourth point, poor relief or programs for the poor, like conditional cash transfers, they do not have popular support. Okay, that's why the budgets don't grow. Programs, it's for the poor. These programs are for the poor. They don't really pay the taxes, and the main taxpayers in a country, they don't benefit from the program, so they don't support the programs. That's why they don't grow. This idea that we can start targeting the poor and that programs will grow and become universal doesn't happen in reality. Let's look at the Mexico situation. The iconic Prospera program is just being abolished, because it's just targeting the poor. It has no political support. In contrast, universal programs have very strong support because they benefit everybody in the population, including taxpayers. Therefore, these programs will grow and grow. and we can see certainly with old age pensions, we have much higher budgets for universal programs and very low budgets for poverty targeted programs. We have much higher transfers for universal programs and much lower transfers for poverty targeted programs. 2 more points, I've only got a minute left. Let's remember poverty targeting, ultimately, when compared to universal provision, benefits the rich, not the poor. Universal provision benefits the poor, not the rich. Why? Because of tax. Poverty targeted programs are very small, there's very low tax, so the rich pay very little of their tax. That's why they like poverty targeted programs. Universal programs, more costly, the rich have more taxes, they get a benefit, but they're net losers. But the majority of the population is a net winner with universal programs. And just finally, so how are we going to do it in an area where we have fiscal constraints? I just put up here an example of the kind of Kenya, of what we could do with Kenya. A number of people are saying, let's prioritize the youngest kids if in an area of constraints. So here in Kenya, we put together a design of a program for every child 0 to 4, starting the program at a reasonable benefit level. It'd be 0.6% of GDP. If we don't take any of those children off the program until they reach 17 years of age, we'll eventually get a program that is universal for everybody aged 0 to 17. And you can see the growth in the costs is relatively minimal year on year if we make reasonably conservative assumptions about economic growth and index those benefits to inflation. And the impacts eventually will be very, very high over time on poverty, much more than we would ever get from a poverty-targeted program. So I'd just like to finish there with just one final plea. I am concerned about the use of the term grant. It sounds like a gift from the government. It doesn't sound like a right. Let's look at another term, universal child benefit, universal child entitlement. But grant, I'm very uncomfortable with that term. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Stephen. The floor is yours, David.
Which one? Good morning. I'm not going to talk about one pivotal issue. I don't think there is one. I'm going to talk about some pivotal aspects of the approach to social protection debates. And I'm only going to... Which one? This one. Right. I'm only able in the time to get through ABC. First of all, analysis. It's not enough simply to say there are X million children in poverty. The analysis needs to probe circumstances, causes, possible solutions, the politics of child poverty. 2 weeks ago, the World Economic Forum met somewhere close in Switzerland, at Davos. The rich and powerful jetted in on 1,500 private jets and heard David Attenborough tell them about the reality of global warming and the perils of being a polar bear. Not one CEO was reported to have a sufficient sense of irony to throw himself off a mountain. There was much talk about growing inequality, winners and losers, but it was noticeable that talk of extreme winning and extreme losing was only sponsored and carried out by the extreme winners. Some talked about the minimum wage, but one suspects none of those who did so had ever worried about paying a bill. In looking at child poverty, I think there's a need to get down and dirty, not just toss around aggregate numbers, look at functioning of families, the distribution of resources and power within them, and recognize that many men and some women spend quite a lot on alcohol, on gambling, not on their children. Look at how policies work in practice. How many public servants treat people as though they were masters, not servants. Some behave as corrupt crooks, and so do some ministers. We need to look at the whole politics of social protection, attitudes to policies. Public opinion shapes what's going to happen, and I'll be saying more about that in one session tomorrow morning. So the analysis, I think, needs to go far deeper than it very often does. secondly, we'll get to breadth. Statements like social policy, social protection is the right of a child, children are all our future. They're all cliches, platitudes. They may be uplifting sometimes, but they don't mean very much. They're a lot of vacuous good intentions, even some in this hall. Social protection isn't a subject, but it's got to be based on ideas drawn very widely from philosophy about rights, obligations, responsibilities, duties, economics, not the irrelevant branch of maths that most economics has become, but real economics as practiced by people like Amartya Sen, Joe Stiglitz, the late Tony Atkinson, and much earlier by people like Kaldor and Keynes. It needs to draw on politics and thinking about political institutions and power. It needs to draw on analysis from social policy of what works from a very wide range of backgrounds. It's not a simple technical subject about which bright young men in smart suits from McKinsey's or Accenture can be much help in my judgment. And last, if we can get there, no, we can't. Clarity, the opposite of confusion. There's an example. There was an example there, briefly, about a statement about the Congress Party in India proposing to implement a universal basic income, but actually it's going to be a variant targeted at the poor, which is not what the Basic Income Earth Network would call a basic income. I don't want to be seen partisan in Indian political terms. I was very critical of what the chief economic advisor to the BJP government said wholly inconsistent things about basic income, that it should be means tested, that it should be restricted. And I accused the IMF of being even worse, including things that weren't even income, things that were not universal, and things that weren't basic, as forms of universal basic income. And that confusion is not uncommon. It certainly pervades everything the British Prime Minister ever says about Brexit. Francis Bacon said the truth emerges out of error, by which he meant testing hypotheses. The truth emerges out of error, not out of confusion. One problem or dilemma, I think, faces international and intergovernmental organizations. They may rely on a certain amount of confusion to paper over a few cracks. The ILO's social protection flaw may be convenient, but in something I wrote, I described it as intellectual mush. It can mean anything to anyone, which is why many agree to it. So it has some uses, but is that enough? I'm not an international civil servant or a national civil servant. I don't have to seek the lowest common denominator or the highest common factor, but I don't think doing that, which is what does seem to happen rather a lot, is much inspiration for the future. What changes minds is a clear vision of the future or alternative futures, different alternatives that are clearly spelt out, scrutinized, compared with each other. And out of clarity, we can pivot, I think, into a better future and at risk of sounding like a cliche, a better future for our children.
Thank you, David. I'll move on right away to Olli Kangas.
Thank you very much for invitation to this great meeting. In the case that I were a Dane and my name would be Hamlet, I would ask, target or not to target? That's the question. But because I'm a Finn, I'm not a Dane. And my Danish friends are always saying that if you ask something from a Finn, he or she says, well, we should start from the civil war. And because I'm a Finn, I start with the civil war. We had a civil war in Finland, and after that we had a very severe Second World War, and the country was very divided and war-stricken. And what they tried to do, they didn't discuss that much should the benefit be targeted or not, but the issue was how to unify the country after the civil war between the reds and whites. And they introduced universal education, universal school food, universal side grant, universal pensions, universal sickness benefits, etc., etc. And it created a unified country. Children of the red families and white families, they were sitting side by side in the same school and eating the same food, and they felt sameness. And of course, when they discussed when and how we should introduce child benefits, in Finland it's benefit, it's not grant. And there were two branches of discussion, and I think that those discussions are reality in every country. One brand was saying that we should give universally to everybody, because everybody should have equal possibilities. And that camp, they said also that the child grant is, or child benefit is compensation of costs of raising children, because it's costly to raise children, and children are the future of our nations and countries. And children are common good, and therefore everybody should finance and participate in financing. Also those who don't have children and those who have children, and then it's not equalizing income between poor and rich, but equalizing costs of taking care of our common future. That's one brand. And that was very decisive for implementing universal child benefit in Finland. And the other camp of argumentation said that it's too costly, it's much better to give only to those poor families. And also they said that in the case that we give money, and that was also one argumentation against universalism, that in the case, and argumentation also against child benefits, that if we give child benefits, then it will increase fertility among the poor families and the low classes, and it will mean that the level of intelligence in the country will go down, because those people who are a little bit stupid, they are somehow seduced to make more and more babies. And that was one argumentation, that kind of eugenicistic argumentation there. But what's very interesting, those camps are still there. And it's an indication that if we implement something, for example, in the Finnish case, universal child benefit, it's not irreversible. There are constant fights on it and surrounding around it, so that it's challenged. And there are lots of, for example, just now, because we had rather a deep international crisis in Finland, economic crisis, and then there were voices and politicians saying that we should abandon this universal child benefit and give it only to the poor people and poor families. But there are two problems. One problem is how to define what is a poor family. And Stephen Kidd was very well and eloquently telling about that. So that who are the poor? It's very difficult to define who is the poor. And at least in the Finnish case, and I suppose that in most cases, there are very, very strong work disincentives linked and to targeted benefit. In that case, that if you are getting something in the case that you are poor, and it's taken away if you increase your income level. And it will increase all work disincentives. And in the case that we will, for example, try to enhance female employment, then it's very detrimental for that. So that those questions, I think, They are not only specific for the Finnish case, but they are more universal.
Thank you. Thank you, Olli. So we move now to the two country examples. Paul, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, really, to be here. Let me begin by saying, well, I belong to a government, the Spanish government, that is embarked right now in a process of upscaling social protection for children. And I talk here as the High Commissioner against Child Poverty about the challenges ahead faced by a country which has paid so far very little attention to child grant provision and is now, starting to update its policies to improve this protection. The Spanish welfare state exhibits from many standpoints a well-equipped system of social protection that ensures high standards of benefits for pensioners, for survivors, a decent level of protection to unemployed people, people with disabilities in need of long-term care. Its health care system is one of the best in the world, which helps Spaniards reach the highest life expectancies in the world. Its education system renders also acceptable outcomes, especially in terms of the extent to which students reach the tertiary level of education. However, the Spanish system of welfare protection lags dramatically behind when we talk about the protection against poverty and social exclusion and policies for children. I should have the thing to get through. So I was saying, it lags behind. Our social expenditures for these policies are significantly lower than expenditures devoted by other rich countries in Europe. And as a result, the capacity of the Spanish welfare state to bring children out of poverty is really low, is negligible. You can see in the slide that Spain stands the last country in terms of capacity to reduce pre-transfers poverty in Europe. We hold one of the highest child poverty in Europe. Well, I don't know how, I don't know how to get back. Well above other countries with similar levels of GDP per capita. So the current Spanish government is determined to update social policies for children and families and improve child grants by expending resources devoted to such policies. But in this context, we face challenges that are common to other countries. In particular, when it comes to decide how we should proceed. The question that was raised by Olli and Kangas. No? Should we go to an universalistic approach, or should we go through the targeted path? We are well aware, I'm well aware, I'm a scholar that studied such issues before. We are well aware of the advantages of the universalist approach, but there are obstacles that prevent us from opting right from the beginning for a universalist strategy, at least, in the short run. First, the cost of a universalist program. There is no way we can pool the amount of resources needed to offer universal child grants to every Spanish child at this moment. If we did so, the amount of resources we could afford to spend would thinly protect the most vulnerable, who are the main priority for my government right now, given our high child poverty rates. Second, universal child grants are not always being perceived as the most legitimate option. In a context where welfare expansion requires new resources collected through taxes, the public opinion often questions whether the rich should also benefit from new schemes that have a marginal effect for their well-being. In fact, our last experience with a universal child grant was quite negative. In 2007, Spain introduced a grant for newborns, the so-called baby check, which was quite generous, 2,500 euros. At that point, public opinion reacted negatively because it was considered as money spent for families that were not in need of such money. The scheme was suspended in 2010 as part of the cutbacks introduced in the austerity package that came with the economic downturn. The third issue, and I want to mention it, I know that I'm out of time, but the third issue to be considered is the existence of social protection for families and children through the so-called hidden welfare state. Most families in Spain benefit from tax expenditures when they have children. And the amount of money they would have to pay goes down when they fulfill the tax forms. But not everybody benefits. In Spain, around 60% of citizens with earnings about a certain amount pay direct taxes and enjoy the tax breaks that they have when they have children and can have their money deducted if they spend the money in certain activities related to child education. That means that child support already reaches most of the middle and high income class, but through the hidden welfare state, because these tax expenditures are less visible. Our challenge is to make money available to the most vulnerable groups who do not benefit from tax expenditures. This is why my government is focusing on improving the allowances of the lowest income group in order to help those families who are not benefiting from tax break. We are still working on a negative tax scheme that would somehow address these issues. But we think that we need to simultaneously make visible existing support through tax expenditures and improve benefits for those not receiving such aid in order to convince public opinion that everybody is receiving its fair share. And working on this current targeted approach is really pursuing, in the long run, a universalist strategy to ensure that every child is going to receive public child support and we can substantially reduce at the same time child poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Pao. Fascinating and important issues. Kumar, floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairperson, distinguished panelists, scholar delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning and namaste to you all. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizer for initiating such a very wonderful discourse, which is very timely and appropriate. To save time and energy, I just would like to start my subject matter quickly. It's my honor to speak on behalf of the government of Nepal at this important forum this year and share our experience on the implementation of social protection issues, especially on child grant programs. In fact, government of Nepal now has initiated drafting a long-term vision of development plan. While drafting the long-term vision, government of Nepal has already estimated some very vibrant economic drivers of social and economic transformation, in which human resource, human capital development has given a very top priorities in its agenda. As we have already estimated of the cream 8 drivers, the human resource management and development is given a most important priorities. So I would like to link or align the child grants with the human resource producing activities. Human capital producing activities. If we are not able to invest to our children, it is almost impossible to create a human capital that we need for the transformation of this globe. So Nepal has clearly understood this vision and initiated investing the budget in a budgetary system from its annual budgets on its periodic plan, and also targeted to spend and generate the fund for the long-term vision of 25 years. So I just would like to share with you a very few experiences that we made during the course of implementation of the social protection issues. Even though that issue is not very, very old, but in the case of Nepal, we initiated this system at the time of Rana regime. It was of the time of 1934 AD. It's a long back we initiated. And we strengthened it as a world as, the people's assistance in 1995. And now we have a lot of provisions on allocating the budgets under the heading of social protections. For example, government of Nepal spends about 4% of its GDP in social protection, which covers 50% of the populations, in which social assistance related expenditures is about, social protection related coverage of the population is about 35. Social security related people's coverage is 9%, and others is 6%. So that on others, there is a child grants. So on the child grants, there are many more schemes the government has initiated working with, like scale up the child grants. That is another important the program government initiated. In fact, it was initiated from 2010, and later it was also worked with the cash transfers, and around 400 rupees per person has been managed to provide as a cash transfer, and in which around 0.56 million of children are benefited, and which is 0.19% of national budget, whereas the social security budget is 9.2% of the total government budget in 2018. So apart from multiplier sector's response to devastating 2015 earthquake, the government of Nepal provided emerging cash transfer to vulnerable people with the support of UNICEF. It was a wonderful program. And now government has initiated a new plan for the child grants, in which remaining 63 districts, already we have had programs in 14 districts, and remaining 63 districts also will be covered within 3 years. And our target is to increase the investment on the child grants, and that is around 1.3%. That will be around 1.3% of our yearly budgets. And to meet the 2030 SDGs agendas, we have already proposed that we will invest around 15% of our budget on social protections. It will be altogether around 10% in 2022. At this time, we will graduate from least developed countries, and in 2030, we will intern into the Middle East countries, and in 2043, in long-term visions, we'll reach into the high-income countries. It is our vision, and we have given, our government has given the highest priority to empower the children and children's mothers from the pregnant to the 5 years old's time, and it is our target. Thank you very much for this platform.
Thank you, Kumar. All right, well, a range of very important and pivotal issues have been raised, indeed. And so, unfortunately, we don't have much time, but I do want to pick on a few of them and ask a few more questions, get the panel to reflect on them before we close. One recurrent theme that came up in several of the presentations is the political economy or politics angle. And we heard Stephen Kidd state that, well, targeting is politically, well, is unpopular. But then we also heard from Spain and other situations which would suggest that, yes, but also the universal approach may not be entirely politically feasible. And that in some contexts, targeting and conditionality may help secure public support for social protection schemes. So I'd like to turn to two panelists on this. I mean, first, David, I mean, it would be helpful to hear from the UK perspective on public attitudes and political support towards means testing in particular. I mean, the UK is a case that has heavily relied historically on means testing and elements of conditionality. What are in your experience, what are your reflections on the extent to which these are components that have helped to secure political support for benefits, including cash transfers?
I think the experience of the UK, it's very doubtful if anyone should draw on the experience of the UK at the moment, but is rather mixed. And what I'd say is that there are both, perhaps not being as clear as I suggested one should be, there are both universal and selective elements in that. That there is a universal system of child grants, child benefit, but that has been somewhat modified in that very high income earners have that withdrawn, which hasn't caused any great political fuss. But the great majority of families with children get a standard child benefit. And at the lower income levels, there is supplementation, and it's very hard to imagine that being completely abolished or assimilated into higher child benefit rates. So that there are virtues in both, and it's a combination. And I'm not sure that in practice, as some of the displays downstairs yesterday afternoon showed, that many countries are combining both a universal element and a selective element, and that really does have some positive advantages, and it seems to be to have been fairly generally accepted, and it's not under serious fire in Britain at the moment.
Thank you. Margaret, I'd like to turn to something you raised around the role of, I don't think you used the term conditionality, but certainly sort of co-responsibilities or the potential role of links to human capital accumulation efforts linked to benefits and cash transfers. In the past, yesterday, and I'm sure this will come up again, I mean, there are debates around the risk that conditionalities pose in terms of possibly acting as an additional screening device, so screening out more vulnerable groups, leading to a range of unintended effects. Could you give us some examples of the ways in which actually, conditionalities have, or co-responsibilities have helped secure access and utilization of public services?
I think the considerations about whether to use co-responsibilities or conditions, they're complicated, and I think they're pretty well known. So it does seem that such labeling, and sometimes it's only labeling, it's not even very much about enforcement, does usually raise the use of the health or education services named. But there are real risks. It's certainly complicated to administer. It certainly, I attended the stigma session yesterday, and it sort of puts hands at the local level in a way that's difficult to monitor. And there is a risk that if children or families are unable to access the service, either because the supply of service is insufficient or, they're disabled children and education is not inclusive, that the power of the income transfer is lost to those families. So I think it's a consideration that has to be taken very carefully. If you look carefully at all of the writings of the sort of World Bank, we actually never take a position that is universally pro-condition. It really has to be thought about, and it very often is a matter, I think, of gaining political support as much as it is of a technical change in how many kids attend the services. So I'm quite thoughtful when it comes to formulation of conditions in a particular circumstance.
So a question to Stephen and possibly to Olli. I mean, one thing that comes to mind when we consider universal child grants or benefits, particularly in countries that have very high numbers of children, where the majority of the population of households have children, is should we just be talking about a UBI? I mean, in practice, what are we talking about if we're talking about delivering a transfer and associated services to the vast majority of the population? I'd like to get your take on that.
I think there's a lot of interest around UBIs, but I think, as Margaret rightly said, there's no real evidence that governments are putting them in place. UBIs look very, very expensive to most governments, so they're not really going to get the political support. Building as we have historically, a life cycle inclusive social protection system where we have benefits for all of us when we reach old age, for all of us when we're children, for all of us when we have a disability, is actually a much more sellable proposition. And I think we can put in place universal child benefits at a much lower cost than a universal basic income at this point in time, which will convince governments about it. And something, I think, coming back to the politics, something that governments can sell in elections. It's really important to think about this. They can sell in elections, win power, and implement something great. I mean, I just want to say the issue around in Mexico around Prospera. Let's remember, while they've killed off Prospera, they've actually put in place 3 universal programs and increased overall spending in social protection at the same time, but are missing out on the group of young children. That's the only group, and that's where things need to change in Mexico, but it's moving towards a more progressive direction anyway.
Okay. Actually, tomorrow we will release our first results on the Finnish universal basic income experiment, so that I don't know yet what to say today on the possibilities of the UBI in Finland or everywhere. But tomorrow I will be wiser. So that now I will limit my comments on universal child benefit, because I know it better. Tomorrow I know the fate of the UBI also better. So it's good to remember that social policy is much more than transferring money from a pocket to another. Social policy unifies people, and social policy builds barriers, so that it's very good to have that in mind. And that was what I tried to say to you, that in the Finnish case, they were very interested in unifying the country and unifying all people by granting universal child benefit, universal education, and universal this and that. And what was also very clever when they built up the universal child benefit, it was paid to mother. And in that case, it gave, for the first time for very, very many mothers, own money, and it was a means, a vehicle of empowering them. And also, and I go back to the universal basic income, is that in very many cases, for example, in the Indian experiment, they are saying that universal basic income is a vehicle of empowering women and giving possibilities to children. But I will not say anything about that more. Tomorrow I will tell you the whole story.
We look forward, yeah, we're waiting for those results. But picking on the question of women, and then I will have to wrap up, but we have talked about the potential sort of second round or secondary effects that a cash grant has, including around what sometimes are labeled, what are labeled behavioral effects. And I'm thinking in particular of women's participation in paid work. And here, the evidence is mixed. We see countries where UCGs are associated with reductions in women's participation in paid work, and others. And I'm thinking in particular of Spain, where a recent study showed that actually the baby bonus that Pau referred to was associated with an increase in women's participation in paid work. This is also a topic of a session later today, which I think is a very important one, because of course when we talk about universal child benefits, in many cases we're talking about payments in practice to women that tend to be the main care providers. I'd love to hear from Pau and Puyal briefly about about the experience in your country and how this is being discussed. I mean, we know why in Spain, for instance, in contrast to, say, Germany or other countries, we see a increase in participation in paid work, but is this an issue that has been discussed, and how is this being taken into account in your current reform?
We have a big issue with fertility rates. We are an aging country that will be facing, a demographic challenge in the next few years. And the focus has been mainly placed there in terms of how child grants could benefit somehow, youth living earlier from parental home, which is also, a pending problem in Spain because young people are leaving home very late and have children very, very late, due both to the conditions of the labor market and the difficulties of reconciling family life and work, and there is a gender issue that needs to be considered because many women are leaving the labor market, still leaving the labor market when they raise kids, or reducing significantly the number of hours they devote to formal or paid work. Okay, so the issue has come up, and basically, it's a way to legitimate, the help to families. Probably the strategy we are pursuing right now is go through the issue of child poverty and the extent to which child poverty is kind of anomalous in a country like Spain.
Thank you. And Kumar, finally, just a reflection on whether this is being discussed, the implications for women, women's roles in women's time use and women's participation in paid work.
Yeah. Thank you. Women are supposed to given more priorities on this program because they are the mothers, they are the potential mothers. So they have the major responsibilities to grow their children. So society, government, and all the communities has to give a more emphasis on the promotion of the health of the woman, especially the women, those who are going to be the potential mother in future. Not only they are to be facilitated with the financial support, but also with the moral support, environment, and growing opportunities are to be provided to them because they are the sources of our children. They are the sources of the human resources required for the economic and social transformation of this globe. So one has to take care of their protection, their growth, and better environment for them to grow, number one. Number two, the resource management is a very important point. Without resources, one cannot allocate the budget. So one has to think about how to generate the resources. That resources has to be generated by the particular societies, those who will be the parents in the future. But based on their income level, based on their, the social economic status, the government has to impose certain percentage of the tax for the promotion, protection, and welfare of the children. And the government has to make a very good system for the delivery of the program. Once the program is issued, the implementation part is very important. So proper management, evaluation, monitoring, and updates is required. For that, a new innovation and R&Ds also should be included in this program, which has not been discussed, and the discourse has not been initiated on that part in this forum. So I just would like to request all the concerned stakeholders to incorporate these issues, including the data generation, because one has to go to the disaggregated data's level to find out the particular situation and position of the family and household. So that is also to be included here, and it will be more beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to ask all the panelists to leave us with a key message, but I note we're out of time. Can I do that, or do we need to close? Okay, well, so just bear with us a few more minutes. A final plea to each speaker. We'll take them in reverse order. In one sentence, what is the one main message or idea you want people who are attending the conference today to take away? Kumaro.
Okay. Everyone is a parents or future parents. So one has to initiate funding for his or her child from now onwards, so that we can secure this program and we can implement it properly in future, and there will be no crisis of the revenue at last.
Pau?
Yeah, well, shortly, I just want to say that we need to take into consideration public opinion. Public opinion is a powerful constraint in the way we, as government, think about advancing child grants.
Olli?
Children are the future, and let's give them equal possibilities to create us a very, very, very good future.
David?
Well, I'll be explaining with analysis, breadth, and I hope clarity tomorrow why I think UCGs are quite a good idea. Sorry. The message, really, I'd put from this session, reinforcing the message from Spain, is that unlike Facebook, WhatsApp, or Twitter, social protection isn't floated in from UNICEF, the World Bank, ILO, or IMF. You've got a lot to choose from, but it's got to correspond with social values, maybe lead those onward, persuade people, but public attitudes are not all stigmatized, judgmental, but people have usually pretty good ideas of what's fair and just, and the system has to go along with that, otherwise it's not going to get public support.
Stephen?
I think now it's the time for change. I think we need to move away from this fixation with these old-fashioned poor relief models that are poor quality and which don't deliver for poor children or children living in poverty. We need to move to something and think about the politics, deliver things that are politically feasible, that are politically popular, and which will gain support. And universal child benefits have that potential. And we need to do all the work on the basis of evidence. Let's really look at the evidence and move away from the myth. And this is where we will bring about change.
We're all on a journey in search of a world where all of the kids are nurtured, healthy, and educated. But we come from very different places, and it may take us different paths to get there.
Perfect, right. So thank you so much to our distinguished speakers. We've heard about a range of critical issues that we started to talk about yesterday and that we will continue to discuss today in the parallel sessions following on from the coffee break, importantly around issues of the effectiveness of alternative design parameters, options for financing, and women's outcomes. We look forward to continued discussion in the days and weeks and months to come. Thank you.